Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Francisco Roque de Pinho began his career as a risk manager at Rothschild before founding the Land Group in 2016. The Land Group is an independent and fully integrated real asset manager and farmland operator of 40,000 hectares in South America. This organization delivers strong financial returns and asset appreciation, with 120 million euros of assets under management, and is now ramping up its focus on adaptive grazing-based approaches to regenerative agriculture. Hello, Francisco, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have you join us today from Portugal, right? And we're excited to hear about the work that you're doing in South America. Your journey into successful regenerative farming wasn't exactly from risk management at Rothschild directly. Tell our followers about the co-founding Union Energy Group and founding Plane Tree Capital as well in between those two career moves.
So definitely, thank you very much. That's a very good question. It's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about when I look back at my career, because I feel my career took a slightly circuitous path before I landed on regenerative agriculture. And so before getting to Union Energy Group and Plane Tree Capital, maybe I'll start not from the beginning, but I'll start by saying that my career has included stints in various sectors in banking, capital markets, management consulting. And it was from 2006 onwards that I started building businesses in a number of real asset sectors like renewable energy and now in farming or agriculture. But that phase started, so not with venture capital, but with a company called Carbon Capital Markets. It was at the time a British startup that operated in the carbon credit markets, which were really a novelty at the time. Those were the carbon credit markets that were created under the Kyoto Protocol. And I joined this company that was a market maker in European emissions allowances. Sorry for the jargon, but you had what was called the EU emissions trading scheme, where companies could trade carbon credits. And that company was a market maker, so it facilitated transactions with a focus on small and medium companies. And the reason I joined was to help create an asset management department from scratch, not to operate under the EU trading scheme, but to invest in emerging markets, in projects that would generate what's called CERs or certified emission reductions, which were carbon credits that could be produced at a fairly low cost and could be imported up to a certain limit into the EU emissions trading scheme. So we started from scratch. We built two funds, one with 30 million of assets under management, another with 300 million of assets under management. And the projects we focused on were methane utilization projects from landfills. So landfills produce methane. We would capture that methane and convert it into energy so that we would have revenues from energy sales and revenues from carbon credit sales. And from coal mine methane in China. China is a huge producer of coal, and had a lot of death from explosions from the methane on those mines. And so we launched the funds to invest in China at the time to capture that methane and basically destroy or burn that gas and generate carbon credits, and in certain cases also produce electricity. So after a couple of years being young and arrogant, I thought I knew everything there was to know in the carbon markets. And we were pioneers, we were old ants, whatever you can call, but just because it was a very new, very recent sector. And so with a colleague, we left in 2008 to create our own company, which was Plane Tree Capital. So Plane Tree Capital was a company that we created to invest or to raise a fund to invest in renewable energy in South America. Because of the way we left Carbon Capital Markets, we continued actually managing one of the funds that we are launched on the Carbon Capital Markets, which was great because we were a cash flow positive startup from day one, which is quite rare. And Carbon Capital Markets were seeking us to launch a second fund, a larger fund, but this time to focus on renewable energy in South America. where the carbon credits would be a smaller part of the revenues, and actually a larger part of the revenues would come from energy sales. So our timing was fantastic. You know that in business, timing is everything. And we just launched this venture capital when the great financial crisis erupted. So we did struggle to raise capital. And not just that, but after a couple of years, Carbon Capital Markets itself was absorbed by one of its shareholders, a company called Trading Emissions that was listed on the London Stock Exchange. And then the money simply dried up. So we were left on our own. We were back to square one. Worse than square one, we're actually now starting from scratch without any capital, not even to pay salaries, not even to pay our trips. So we funded that ourselves. So we decided we had to reinvent ourselves, and we started looking for renewable energy projects in South America that we would develop and fund on a deal-by-deal basis. So no longer with the funds as we planned to do initially, but on a deal-by-deal basis, which gave more transparency to investors, therefore should theoretically be easier for investors to invest in. And looking at South America, we found a niche that we thought was very attractive, which was the opportunity to develop what's called run-of-river hydropower projects in Peru. Run-of-river hydropower projects are small-scale power projects which have minimal impact and are considered renewable energy projects. And what we saw in Peru was a country that had an incredible, mostly underdeveloped hydrological resource. You have plenty of water in the Andes, flowing both ways towards the Amazon, on the other side towards the Pacific. And at the time, it had a very favorable regulatory environment. And they had a very interesting mechanism whereby you had auctions that allowed you to bid for and win 20-year dollar-denominated power purchase agreements, which are long-term purchase agreements for our power, which allowed us then to finance those projects by mitigating the risk for the investors, for the banks, and so on. So a third of the way, we through our work, we sold Plane3 Capital to an investment holding company that focused on real assets in South America, and Plane3 sort of over time morphed into Union Energy Group. So it's more or less the same company. It's not actually, it's two separate companies, but what we did at Plane3 Capitals was the base of Union Energy Group. So being part of that group, Joaquin Labella, my Uruguayan business partner, who's still with me today, and we had more resources to develop and build projects. And by the time we both left the group, for me at the end of 2015 and for Joaquin early 2016, we were operating a plant with 6 megawatts. We had 27 megawatts well under construction. We had a couple more projects that had won PPAs at these auctions that I mentioned. And we had quite a large pipeline of projects of up to 300 megawatts. So that was quite a sizable business. And the Union Energy Group continued without us and was eventually sold in 2018 to a company called Polaris Infrastructure, which is a Toronto-listed company.
Okay. So now that's a very full history. And in fact, I wanted to say that we recorded a program with Tim Gosher, who is the founder of the Dolma Funds in Nepal, which also does run-of-river renewable energy projects there. That's very supportive of that small regional economy to try and defer or eliminate some of the coal-fired power plants that are literally dumping refuse on the glaciers in the mountains there and melting them faster than they would otherwise. And so that's a run-of-river is a very fascinating concept to me, because I grew up in Louisiana, where there are no hills higher than about 10 feet. So this is a very interesting part of your trajectory and your career. Now, how can cutting-edge regenerative agricultural practices, which you're now focused on full-time, as I understand it, how can things like adaptive grazing address the climate risk issues of industrial-scale farming, including soil degradation, biodiversity loss, and greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure. I think before going into that, I think it's important we state the problem and the fundamental problem. And I think we agree that conventional industrial-scale farming that was really created and has evolved since the Second World War, it cannot sustainably feed 10 billion people, which we are projected to have on our planet by 2050. And it leads to soil depletion, water issues, chemical runoff, biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, and ultimately rural decline. And we often forget that this industry also depends a lot on limited resources. Think about fossil fuels, phosphates, and chemicals, which have complex supply chains that are easily disrupted. And the result of all of that is that whenever you look at your plate, you look at expensive and basically nutritiously deficient, environmentally unsustainable food. So that's not sustainable over the long run. So to move the needle to build a more sustainable, resilient food system, we need to look at regenerative farming, as well as organic farming or biofarming. But now we're going to talk about regenerative farming. And one of the issues with regenerative farming is that there's no, well, there are many definitions for that, many practices, and I'll go through that. And that's one of the weaknesses of the industry, because then it's easy to attack the regenerative farming industry, because of the breadth of the definitions, anyone can reduce their use of pesticides, for example, or fertilizers, and they can claim that they are doing regenerative farming. And as a result, we are seeing already a lot of greenwashing related to regenerative farming. So I think it's important to agree first on a definition. I'm not going to create a definition. I'm going to steal it from one of our industry colleagues, a company called SLN Partners. And the definition is: regenerative agriculture consists of growing nutritious food and other products in a way that enhances soil health, climate stability, and ecosystem functionality, while being economically sustainable for the farmer. And that last point is very important, because a lot of people think that it's doing good for the planet at the expense of the revenues of the farmers. But in reality, a lot of those practices, if you implement them well, actually make you more money as a farmer. And that's an important point. And so taking a step back, it's a biologically focused approach to farming that is guided by 5 principles. The first one is you minimize soil disturbance. You reduce tillage or you avoid tillage altogether. You keep the soil surface covered at all times. So you don't want to have bare patches of land, and because then it's subject to erosion and you lose the topsoil. You maintain living roots in the soil, because those roots are very important for soil structure and for returning carbon to the soils. You cultivate a diversity of crops, and you integrate grazing animals. And within these 5 principles, you can derive a broad range of practices, whether that's cover cropping, reducing tillage, as I just mentioned, retaining biomass residue, rotating crops, agroforestry, rotational grazing, and we'll get into that. That's what we do with the cattle, or harvesting rainwater. And even the creation of windbreaks, hedgerows, to name just a few of those practices that fall within this large definition of regenerative agriculture. So with these practices, so as I mentioned to you, some people just apply one and they claim they are regenerative farmers, but using these practices most often in combination. For example, in Uruguay, we do rotational grazing on natural grasslands, but we also do rotational grazing of livestock with a crop pasture system. We rotate livestock with soybean, for example. So we plant soybean for a couple of years, and then we plant pastures for 4 years. And this is a regenerative practice that restores the soil after taking a lot of nutrients out of the soil by planting soybean, for example.
Okay.
So when you use these practices either in isolated form or in combination, you end up generating a broad range of benefits, whether from, most important for a farmer, increased yields, but ultimately also more resilient, self-sustaining farming operation. And some of the effects that you notice when you start applying those practices are better soils with increased organic matter contents, improved structure. You see also better water infiltration and retention, and that's a direct consequence of the improved structure. So the more structure you have in your soils, the more water your soils absorb, the less you suffer from water waste and erosion. You also see a much richer microbial activity, which you need to have an efficient nutrient cycling and to produce the rich, nutritious food that you want to see on your plates. You rely less on synthetic inputs, which is great because you reduce your costs and you are less exposed to disruptions from wars, from COVID, from whatever happens. You have less weeds, pests, diseases, because their natural cycles get disrupted. All of these are typically a symptom of unbalanced ecosystems, and they are disruptors. So in effect, by using regenerative agricultural practices, you end up disrupting the disruptors, as I like to say. You have more biodiversity, and that has a lot of attendant benefits. If you have more insects, if you have more bees and so on, you benefit from that. From a livestock perspective, which is very important for us, you have a happier, healthier livestock. So our cattle are much happier and more healthy. We use less medicine. We don't use antiparasitics and so on. And they can also express their natural behaviors. These animals are supposed to be roaming around and grazing, and not to be stuck into a confined animal feeding operation where they are standing with thousands of other cattle, and they can barely move. And an overall or overarching environmental benefit of all these regenerative practices is that you have also less greenhouse gas emissions, which is obviously important for climate change mitigation.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago this concept of the tremendous growth that we're looking forward to, and that has a lot of potential environmental and climate impact that comes along with it, of having 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. How are the investors that you work with incorporating that kind of consideration into the work that they do with the land group? You work with high net worth individuals, institutions, family offices, etc. Are a lot of these people tuned in to the kinds of considerations that you've been talking about?
Yes, they do. They do. Generally, these investors, they have their own capital allocations. Mm-hmm. They're like we would expect from any of those sophisticated investors. They have very sophisticated capital allocation models, and they invest in anything from liquid securities to highly liquid assets, such as farmland, and typically the more concerned ones and the more sophisticated ones tend to allocate part of the capital, up to 5% or more, to real assets that provide them with inflation protection, because so the real assets tend to be quite correlated with inflation, especially farmlands. These assets allow to preserve wealth through generations, and this is particularly relevant for family offices. The investors we work with, we are there to actually help them get that well-managed exposure to farmland investments. We make owning land. Owning land is never straightforward, and we make the process of owning land straightforward and easy for them, because we take care of the entire process from acquisition through to exit at the end of their holding period. Regenerative practices, they are not, for the moment, top of mind. And it's important for certain investors. For the others, like family offices that are mostly concerned about wealth preservation, it's not their primary driver. But once we explain to them the benefits that these practices have for their assets, they are on board, and they encourage us to apply them at their farms.
Okay. So now we've just had a COP 16 was just held in Cali, Colombia, with several landmark biodiversity agreements being reached. And the COP 30 Climate Summit next year in 2025 will be held in the Amazonian city, and I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing this right, but Belém do Pará in Brazil. Why does Latin America offer such massive opportunities for making progress in climate adaptation and mitigation practices?
Sure. Well, I remember I was a kid at the time, that I remember back in 1992, we had the first of such conferences, which was the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. So that summit, or that conference, really kicked off everything. It led to the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, or UNFCCC, which then gave birth to all this series of COPs, or Conference of the Parties. So historically, there's already a big link or a big relationship between South America and all this series of COPs. And the location of that conference at the time reflects the important role that South America can play in making progress on addressing climate change. And that's due to a number of factors. Number one, South America has an outstanding biodiversity and has incredible natural resources. So whether you're talking about the Amazon forest or the Argentinian pampas, you have huge areas that are incredible biodiversity. As a matter of fact, I believe South America is responsible for 40% of the world's biodiversity, and 25%, and that's 25% of its forests, which are unfortunately reducing in scale. So there are these assets that are at risk from climate change, and but having also these different environments really creates the necessary environment to test a number of climate adaptation strategies adapted to all these different environments. So that's number one. Second, they have a tremendous, massive renewable energy potential. Think about all the hydropower that you have in countries like Brazil, Peru, Chile, and more recently, they've developed quite a lot of capacity in wind power, solar power, the geothermal power in certain cases. And let's not forget the biofuels. Brazil is a world leader in biofuels, which is a renewable energy. Another point is the depth and breadth of the agricultural industry, and Brazil there is a good example. They have a lot of lands. They are one of the largest producers of several different commodities, and so they can experiment a lot. They have a lot of scope to experiment. At the same time, they are at risk from climate change. They are strongly motivated to find solutions and to experiment. And so they are quite ahead in regenerative practices, in ag-tech solutions, and so on. But that's not only Brazil. So Brazil is you can picture all these very large monocultures, whether that's soybean, sugarcane. But if you look at Peru or Chile, you have much smaller productions of high margin products like avocado. So across the continent, you have a lot of scope to experiment and to improve the agriculture practices that are currently in use. Importantly, all of that is at risk because climate change brings deforestation, floods, malnutrition, and that drives the local people to be creative and look for solutions and to be global leaders, as evidenced by their role in the Earth Summit and more recently in the COP16 in Colombia and COP30 in Brazil next year.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that update on what's happening in South America. And in addition to family offices, your company, the Land Group, works with a lot of institutional investors as well, insurance companies, pension funds. How are those kinds of investor groups being attracted to the work that you're doing, and how do they find out about the possibility of investing in the Land Group?
Sure, there's a groundswell of interest currently for regenerative farming, and that's for a variety of reasons. Main one is a concern for climate change, and here I'd like to open a parenthesis. Regenerative farming is often touted as the silver bullet solution for climate change, which it isn't. It's not going to replace totally conventional agriculture, at least not in the short or medium term. And yes, it mitigates emissions, it reduces emissions, but it's not going to solve the issue. What is going to solve the issue will be for us to stop using fossil fuels, removing the carbon that has been underground for millions of years, and stop burning it and releasing it in the atmosphere, because that is the real cause of climate change. All the rest is a sideshow, and no one is really ready to give up on the cars, on the planes, and so on. So that makes regenerative agriculture an easy target for people who want to attack the regenerative agriculture, because it's easy. There are not enough studies yet. It's still a young industry, so it's very easy to attack regenerative farming and essentially say it's worthless, it doesn't work. And first of all, we like to downplay the role of regenerative farming in solving in addressing climate change. And when we talk to investors, what we tell them is that regenerative agriculture is a better way to produce food, because for you as the owner of the asset, it will allow you to have a higher yield in terms of kilos or tons of product per hectare. It will reduce your costs because you will need to use less synthetic inputs, which are costly. And as I mentioned before, they tend to have very volatile prices because of their disrupt the supply chains that are easily disrupted. It also allows you to produce whether that's meat or grains that you can, or in the future will be able to sell at a premium to conventionally produced food. And finally, it's very good for you over the long run, because the changes that you making to your land really increases the value of your land over the long run. Because you in 10 years, if you start applying regenerative practices today, in 10 years you will have much better soils, which you can prove by core sampling, by showing the structure of your soils and the carbon contents. You will have, those soils will keep the water that they get, so they are more resilient to droughts. Just as an example, we recently visited in Portugal a farm that does exactly what we do in Uruguay. But there's a difference that in Uruguay, you tend to have, of course, Uruguay has certain droughts, but the weather is quite constant throughout the year. In Portugal, you always have very dry summers. And when we were going to visit that farm, a few kilometers before we got into that farm, we looked around. This was at the end of summer, and it was scorched earth. All the earth was exposed, dry. You could only see weeds growing, which is the typical site that you have in the Alentejo region here at the end of summer. And when we entered that farm that does rotational grazing the way we do, everything was lush and green, and the cows, the livestock had a lot to eat. And that's a very good example of the resilience that you can build into your lands by applying regenerative practices consistently. And in this case, this farmer had been doing it for 2.5 years. So you can imagine that over 10 years, you really build a very resilient farming system, which you can pass on to your children, or which you can sell, and you get more value than you invested in, just because you have improved it dramatically. So we focus a lot when speaking with investors. We focus a lot on those aspects, which is immediate financial aspects to the yield, long-term value creation, resilience, and all the rest is a huge upside. So the fact that you actually addressing climate change, might be able to get carbon credits for that is a plus. Increased biodiversity obviously is a plus, because then you can also start having tourists staying at your farm, and so on and so on. So there's all these benefits that we do not put in the equation. So we do not tell these investors you should invest to feel good because you're doing something good for the world. You invest because it's in your financial interest to buy these lands, apply those regenerative farming practices. It will be good for you financially, and you have all these pluses that you can be happy about.
You know, Francisco, it sounds like regenerative farming really, the land speaks for itself after just a few years. It doesn't require 2 decades or a decade and a half to see results. So that's really impressive. Now, thank you very much for spending the time with us today. There's one other thing that I want to touch base on, and before we find out where our followers can get in touch with you about the Land Group's work and how they can reach out with questions for your focus about issues that we've discussed in today's program, and that is that you're also a member of a surfing group. Can you spend just 30 seconds telling us about that? You participate in a big wave surfing group. Can give us the name of it?
Sure. I am the co-founder of a big wave surfing team in Nazaré. That team is called Team Red Herrings, and it's really. I started surfing in Nazaré back in 2017 when I moved from London to Portugal, and I was drawn to it just by curiosity. And I never thought I would ever surf big waves. As a matter of fact, I was a very average surfer of normal waves, but I just got drawn to it. I tried it. I loved it. I nearly died on my second or third attempt, and then I had the choice between giving up or continuing. And that's the moment I decided, no, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it very seriously. So I started training, doing a lot of physical training, looking at being careful with what I eat, training apnea, breath hold, and so on and so on. And then over the years, I've been doing this is my 8th season. So we together with Lorenzo Katzenstein, with the co-founder, we started building Team Red Herrings. And Team Red Herrings today is a big wave surfing team that develops young big wave surfing talent. So obviously I'm excluded from that definition. and the particularity of that is, in exchange for all the resources that we are putting at the disposal of those surfers, who are essentially risking their lives in the biggest wave in the world in Nazaré. And so that requires a lot of safety equipment, jet skis, and so on. So it's a lot of that mobilizes a lot of resources. And what we ask our team members in return is that they pay it forward by participating in ocean-related environmental and social initiatives. So I think it's a pretty unique positioning. I'm not aware of anyone else doing that in surfing. And so it's a way to really catalyze these the efforts and time into this type of projects that we like. For example, taking children from less privileged neighborhoods to learn to surf. And it works quite well for everybody.
That's terrific. That's really I always wonder how our guests can incorporate what they're doing related to sustainable business of any kind into working with younger generations. And this is a perfect example of that. It's the Red Herring Group. Is that what it's called?
It's Team Red Herrings Nazaré.
Team Red Herring. Okay, great. Well, I'm sure some of our followers who are surfers will be interested in checking it out. Now, Francisco, where online can followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast go to learn more about the Land Group's work? And how can they reach out to you with questions about the issues that we've discussed in today's episode?
Sure, there are a number of resources. Number one is our website, which is the-land-group.com. And there they will find the usual static information about our strategy, our activities, our team, our properties. But there's a section which is quite interesting there called Field Notes, which is essentially a blog. And that we update regularly with industry news, research, company news, media appearances, and so on. And then under those Field Notes, there's a section called Gallery, which is my favorite one, because that's where we upload very nice photos and videos of what we do. And sorry for the tired old cliche, but as you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I would check our website. Besides websites, we have LinkedIn and Instagram accounts, both institutional and personal. And it's very similar content to what we have in our Field Notes, but it's easier to engage, easier to put comments and to send us messages. But they can always contact us through the contact form on our website, or through LinkedIn or Instagram, or they can also send an email to me. And my email is francisco@the-land-group.com, just like our website.
Okay. Well, terrific. Yes. And I've visited your website. It's very engaging pictorially, but it's also got a lot of great information about the work that you're doing. So thanks again to Francisco Roque de Pinho of the Land Group for joining us today in today's episode. And followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast can join me again next week. I'm Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.